Hello and welcome to another episode of Trans Uncensored, the show so naughty we wouldn't even censor nipples even if they were female presenting. I'm your host, Verity Ritchie, which is Latin for truly bitchy. The topic of the hour is transitioning to non-binary. Today I'm joined on the phone with Tovah from Texas. Tovah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Tovah. I'm non-binary, use they, them pronouns, and yeehaw, from Texas.
I am also non-binary. I guess I should mention that. But Tovah and I are sort of, we've got that, the opposite kind of non-binary journey that we've gone on. We've swapped hormones. I was assigned male at birth, and Tovah was assigned male, and Tovah was assigned, and Tovah was assigned female at birth. But we sort of, I think we both feel like we land in the same position or a similar position in the gender spectrum.
Yeah, I feel like it's pretty similar, probably in a lot of ways. I think it's hard to know exactly. I also think gender is really confusing.
Well, we actually used to be roommates, and I remember feeling quite strongly that we had the same gender and no one else in the world else did. It was just you and me. We had the same gender, and that gender was hairy and bisexual.
It's really the best of the genders out there.
But since the time that we used to live together, I haven't been back to Texas in years, but since that time we have actually both started hormones, so transitioning in a medical way. So I thought it would be interesting to explore this together because we both very much felt that we were in the same place in terms of our internal sense of gender back in the day. But at this time, we're moving in sort of opposite directions in terms of at least medical transition.
Yeah, I think we started to figure things out about our gender around the same time. And I think it was really helpful for us to be living together so we could work through that together. It would have been, I think, more confusing if I didn't have anybody in my life while I was starting to kind of like realize that I was non-binary.
Well, you were a bit of an inspiration to me because when we first met, we were both going to this feminist discussion group. And at the beginning of every meetup, they asked us what our names were and what our pronouns were, which had never happened to me before. I'd never been asked my pronouns. And I remember first coming and you were saying they and them pronouns. And I was saying he and him pronouns. And over the course of about 6 months, I was ready to say maybe they and them pronouns. but you were there first. So like, how did you manage that?
I went through a similar process, I think just a little bit before you did. And honestly, I was probably just because I was a gender and sexualities major in college, and a lot of classes in that major would do that.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Yeah, for me, it was like having the freedom of being in a space where I was repeatedly asked to gender myself, essentially, was how I got to the place where I was like, oh, this is really an option. This has never been optional before. And like, I get to tell everyone all at once, and you don't have to like pull everyone aside, when you have that option to come out in that way.
Yeah, I definitely didn't start saying they and them the first time I was asked. It took a while, and it took, seeing other people doing that and even knowing that was an option. I didn't know that genderqueer or non-binary people existed until I was in college. I just felt bad about myself for a long time and didn't know why.
Interesting. Yeah, I did, because when I was about 18, and I remember thinking, okay, I get this transgender thing, I get that there can be transgender women and transgender men, but surely there's another option. And I just Googled it, and I just Googled what's the in-between transgender thing. And it was, at the time, it was genderqueer. And so from the age of 18 till probably about 5 years ago or 6 years ago or something, in my head I was like, okay, genderqueer is the word. And I think, like, I've got YouTube videos about my gender, and it looks like I came out as genderqueer in 2012, And I made a video in 2014 as well called something like "Why Am I Genderqueer?" So like as recently as 2014, I was identifying as genderqueer as opposed to non-binary, and I thought that was the word. Do you remember that?
I do, and that's the word that I used to use before as well. I think the reason that I changed is because I often just use what is going to be most recognizable to people,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess non-binary is just more in fashion right now. Most people, I think, haven't even heard of genderqueer or non-binary people, so I'm happy to just use whatever is going to get me at least a little bit of recognition instead of people being totally confused and me having to explain everything to them.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, these words are tools, right? And they need to be helpful for us. Otherwise, there's no point hitting a nail with a shoe. Or maybe if it's I have some really heavy boots because I'm still a goth at heart. Yeah, I mean, from what I've seen online, around the time that Google Trends shows that non-binary became more popular, it was around the same time the first person got legal gender recognition as non-binary. So it seems like the legal term is what kind of popularized it. The idea of like legislation. I think. I mean, that's what it seems like to me. I haven't seen any other proof as to why there was the switch.
Yeah, I haven't done a deep dive into that. It could be interesting to look it up. I just get tired, and I just will take the path of least resistance sometimes.
I mean, I almost invariably identify as non-binary because there's now this idea that like non-binary is the umbrella term and then genderqueer is like a type. So like, are you agender? Are you bigender? Are you genderqueer? Are you a gender faun or a gender fae? Are you a demi-gender? And so I feel like if I say genderqueer, they're going to be like, you're not non-binary. You're a subgroup of non-binary. And I'm like, no, I'm really nothing. I'm nothing.
That's interesting. I've always thought of those two as being the same thing, but then having, some things under. I thought that they were both the umbrella terms. Because I also will tell people I'm gender fluid sometimes if they're somebody who understands more of those things. I think because it just explains more of my experience of my feelings about my gender constantly changing dramatically. Sometimes I'll feel really dysphoric about one thing, and the next day I'll feel really happy about it, which has also made transition, like medical transition, very difficult.
How's that going?
It's going okay. It depends on the day you ask me. I think in some ways it's made me feel better, and then other days I wake up and I'm like, oh, this was a huge mistake, and I feel a lot of regret. So it's been a difficult ride.
Yeah, I've never quite understood gender fluidity. That's never quite resonated with me. For me, it's always been the sense that like I don't have a gender, and like gender is fake, and it's just like that. Like I opt out, and I don't like it, but like I know like socially that it's relevant to my life, and transitioning for me has always been about like getting to choose. Do people still see me as a man? Can I step away from that?
Yeah. So in that way, I think our experience of gender is a little different.
Yeah.
I think for myself, I probably see like having stretches of time when I'm on T and then stretches of time when I'm not. I remember my doctor, when I went in, asked me what my transition goals were, and I had to tell her that I didn't know, and I was really scared that was going to make her not give me hormones.
Yeah, so can you tell us a little bit about that process? Because not every country has this kind of option to have that much fluidity when it comes to transitioning. They often want you to either like transition into a man or transition into a woman, and there's no in between. But that hasn't quite been your experience, right?
Yeah, and it's only pretty recently, I think, that here in Texas it's been an option, or probably just in Austin or some of the bigger cities in Texas, honestly. I think a lot of the doctors here still want to put you into those boxes, and if you don't get a therapist letter or prove to them that you really are a man or a woman, they're very gatekeepy in that way. But there's a new clinic here called the Kind Clinic, and they focus primarily on, they started off as a PrEP clinic, and now they do PrEP and gender care, and they're fully informed consent. You just go in, you tell them what you want, they'll tell you, you know, the risks and guidelines they would suggest, and as long as, you know, you tell them that's what you still want, they'll let you do it.
So do you get to microdose?
Yeah. She explained to me like the different doses that I could take. She's like, most people start at this, but if you wanted to start even lower than that, you're free to do that. And we talked about just slowly ramping it up over time. So I started with a really, really low dose, and now I'm like on a lower end of average dose.
So do you feel like you're transitioning to a non-binary body in a way?
I guess that's hard because I feel like, you know, my body is and always has been a non-binary body because it's mine. But I'm transitioning to, I guess, a body that other people will read that way more often.
Yeah, I think that's often, if not usually, what transition is, right? It's trying to have our outsides match our insides.
Yeah, I've always kind of wondered if we lived in a different kind of world that didn't put all these expectations and judgments and things like that on us, if I would experience as much dysphoria as I do on some days. And some days I don't feel any at all. It really like shifts so dramatically, and it can do that within a few hours.
I sometimes imagine what would it be like if I was in some like really, I don't know, simpler ancient society from like thousands of years ago, and they would just like, would they just like allow me to live like as a woman or part-time as a woman or whatever, you know, because they were very gendered roles, and nowadays roles are less gendered, and maybe that would kind of alleviate my feeling of social dysphoria if I had that option to just sort of opt out of manhood in a social sense. But I definitely don't feel like I have that kind of social fluidity. I feel like it has to be one or the other.
Yeah, I feel like it's just so, the binary is so ingrained in us since we're children that, you know, even people who are very aware of these things will still often put you in the man or the woman box.
Yeah.
Even if it's not like a conscious thing. I think we're all guilty of doing that to some extent.
Yeah, I don't even know if it's necessarily bad. Like, well, I don't know. I guess it's only really bad for well, maybe some cis people who don't like easily pass as their own gender, but then for people who look androgynous and they like looking androgynous and they like being mistaken for a man or mistaken for a woman or whatever, I guess that's beneficial. But I just feel like gender is supposed to be something that you can easily recognize. Like, I feel like that's part of what people expect gender to be. And in a way, like, do we even count as gendered if we break the rules of gender to the point where people aren't sure what to call us or how to identify us?
I mean, that's ideally where I would like to be. I feel like if I was getting, you know, because getting put in the man box or the woman box, both of those are misgendering. But if it happened like almost 50-50, you know, I don't think I would feel bad about it if it was just like changing a lot. I think the reason that I get upset is I always get put into the woman box, and that starts to feel pretty bad. And like I'm not being seen for who I am at all. If it was switching up back and forth, I think I would feel even a little bit more seen, even though I'm constantly being misgendered still.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like in terms of recognizability of gender, I think we are moving towards the idea that androgyny equals non-binary, and like as a third gender expression. And I don't know, it seems like to some people that would be the ideal, as if like you could be recognized as non-binary. And I have mixed feelings about that. I think I would like to be recognized as non-binary. I think like I would like strangers to assume that I'm non-binary, but I don't know if that's really something you can do without policing gender roles, right? Because in order to reinforce like this idea that androgyny equals non-binary, then you have to reinforce the idea that femininity equals womanhood and masculinity equals manhood.
Right, I definitely agree with that. But I don't know, it's just, I don't think there's a perfect solution because everybody has their own feelings about gender and their own things that they want So that can become really hard on, what is the ideal world? What is the ideal way that we recognize each other?
What is non-binary?
Oh, I don't know. It's a lot of things. It's confusing and it's a mess.
Yeah. Like, is gender real?
I couldn't tell you.
It is unclear.
I think it's real to a lot of people. I think gender is important for a lot of people. For some people, for me, it's just felt like almost like an unsolvable problem, in a way, because of how often my feelings change, and every time I take steps to try to feel better or more stable with it, or reduce the amount of bad days I have, I'm just feeling dysphoric in different ways. Or I make a change and then my gender feelings and dysphoria shifts, and that change is now what I don't want. It's kind of like chasing a target that's always moving around.
To me, it feels really difficult that like gender lines can blur in real life, but like that's actually not what non-binary is, and I kind of wish it was. Like non-binary, because to have a gender identity is so intangible, and it's not even necessarily, it doesn't have to be connected to your pronouns or your gender expression or your body. None of those things have to be attached to your gender. So that intangibility of it, I found a little bit frustrating, because it's like I have nothing to aim for. I guess this is a difference between now like gender fluid versus like kind of a gender experience, where like you feel like you're going for a moving target, and I'm like, where's the target? There's no fucking target.
Yeah, I can see them both being frustrating in their own ways.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions from our listeners. Well, one of them is a question from someone in your life that I was wondering if you could answer. Because someone asked you recently, are you going to get a penis attached to you?
Yeah, but actually, like, I'm going to get two, and it's going to be one on each of my shoulders, I think. But then I would have to alter all my clothes, so, I'm still thinking about that one.
And, like, when you get a penis attached, it's like PlayDoh or something, right? Like, it's like, I was thinking I was gonna like DIY it. I was just gonna get my sewing kit out and stitch it on there. Mm-hmm. I think it's a really interesting, like, it's such a beautiful question. Are you gonna get a penis attached to you? Because I feel like it says so much about cisgender people's understanding of their own genitals, that they think that if you don't already have a penis, you find one and you like sew it on or something, right?
Yeah. It's also just wildly inappropriate to ask somebody about their genitals like that. In that way, it's funny, but it's still, don't do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's good to respond with a question about the other person's genitals. If they've gone there already, you're like, oh, you've opened up the door, so we're gonna like get naked now. Is this what the deal?
I don't think most people would like that very much.
Yeah, well, they asked.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, one of the questions is, how do you deal with feeling not trans enough? And, this reminds me of a memory that I have of us way back in the day when a friend said to us, well, you guys are both transgender, right? And we both went, no.
Yeah, I remember that.
And it's so funny in hindsight, because now we're like officially, once you start popping those pills, right, and getting those injections, you're like official. Like no one can doubt you. You're like, that's you.
People can still doubt you.
Yeah.
For sure.
Do you still ever have that feeling that you're not trans?
Yeah, sometimes when my feelings about gender shift or change, or I start to feel unsure about, if I should be on HRT right now, sometimes I get this like anxiety, self-doubt feeling of, oh, well, maybe I was just faking it the whole time for attention or something, which it's not true. I just have an anxiety disorder, but I do feel that way still sometimes.
How do you deal with it?
It depends on the day. Sometimes I just get really stressed out and feel bad about it. Sometimes I like talk to somebody about how I'm feeling and get some external validation that it's real. And even if I do, stop hormones and start them again at some point, or whatever I do in terms of medical transition, I still count and it's still real.
Yeah, I feel very validated by medical transition, but like that's obviously not like sound advice for if you're just not feeling trans enough. But also, I sometimes I just don't want to be trans. Like, I just want to be a person. I don't want to think about whether or not I've like transitioned away from what's conventional for society. Like I've done something that's different, or like I'm inherently different from everyone. I just want to be a person. And then that's how I feel at this point, now that I have this kind of like deep validation in terms of like who's the transist, like I feel like, so obviously it's bullshit, right? Who is the transist? But you definitely get you definitely get this shit. And I feel like one thing that makes you the most trans is like medically transitioning, and I've got that. Also, another thing that some people think makes you sort of the most trans is being non-binary, and I've got that too. So I'm like the mostest trans now.
I haven't heard that one.
Really? Oh, I mean, it's just people who are very pretentious.
Okay.
And they're like, oh, that's a binary trans. I'm a non-binary trans. I don't know. But
that's fine. That's fine.
But yeah, so I feel validated in that. I don't really feel like many people are gonna try and like try and argue with me or try and convince me that I'm like less trans than them at this point. But now that I am in this place, like I am kind of like, now that I'm so comfortable with it, like it doesn't feel like something I need to fight for anymore. But that leaves me in a weird place of kind of wishing, God, I kind of wish this wasn't like, my whole life didn't revolve around kind of like fighting gender.
Yeah, it does take up a lot of time and energy.
Yeah.
It can be exhausting sometimes.
There's also this idea that like being non-binary is not necessarily trans at all. Like you can be neither trans nor cis and be non-binary, which I think is like technically inaccurate, but there's definitely like a movement towards this like, I am nothing, I'm everything and nothing, and I'm not trans and I'm not cis, I'm beyond that. But I mean, I think that we kind of had this attitude that we're like maybe not cis and not trans, and that's why we both felt before we transitioned it was harder for us to say that we were trans. But I didn't feel like I had to necessarily fight to be trans. Like I didn't feel like there was anyone that I had to prove that I was trans to. Like I was happy to be non-binary, I think. And I mean, this is obviously something that must come from outside pressure, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think for me it was just like I'd spent so much time feeling certain things and not knowing where they were coming from, so just suppressing them and telling myself that those feelings weren't real. And then, starting to come to terms with my gender, it just took a little while to actually like feel very confident that those feelings were real and that I could be part of this community. I think I just worried about, being rejected from the trans community. Because I think sometimes even binary trans people don't think that non-binary people are real.
Yeah, for sure. I think trans communities can have this competitiveness. I mean, I've experienced both, I think, this kind of like who is the most this and who's the most that. But I've also, on the other hand, experienced more wholesome communities where like it's just open and like no one cares and there's no pressure. I mean, it's really easy for me to accept that kind of person who like doesn't feel like they are trans because they're non-binary and they're not transitioning, and maybe they have a conventional gender expression, because I was there, and I know that your life will be more complicated than just you're not trans now, and therefore I don't know.
Yeah, and when I was talking about those fears, I think a lot of it was just coming from seeing people be assholes online. But when I actually did embrace that label and went to some trans meetups and things like that, I wasn't rejected. People were great, so the fears were pretty unfounded, but I did have them and it kept me in that space of not saying I was cis or trans for a while.
Mm-hmm. I like that non-binary as like a term and as like an attitude and a perception of my sense of self. It gives me a sense of freedom. The same kind of freedom I think that I feel about bisexuality. I just feel like I'm free from all of it. I don't have to choose anything. Whatever feels right for me is fine.
Yeah, I'm trying to get to that kind of a place. I've just been really stressed about gender lately, and I think it's still trying to find out if being on HRT is what I actually do want. In some ways, it's made me feel, really good about, certain things with my body, and in other ways, it's made me just become a lot more aware of gender, when before I would often just try to not think about it. So I'm still in a place of kind of figuring things out for myself.
Yeah, I think like for me, I had to come to terms with my body the way it was, and I spent years and years working on like being comfortable with my body. But then starting hormones and stuff, your body becomes like a sculpture, and it's like you once you've opened up the door of change, there's no coming to terms with it as it is, because you have all these options. And in a way, it feels like too many options. Like, what do I do next? Like, do I halt here? Am I satisfied and happy where I am? Well, I'm never really going to be happy with my body. I don't think many people are very easily comfortable and happy with their bodies. Well, maybe they are. I don't know. I don't know. But like, I have a hard time. Like, I had a hard time before coming to terms with my old body, and now I have a new body, and it's in a constant state of change and flux. So, like, at what point do I say, okay, this is the body that I pick and I choose to keep it, and now I have to come to terms with and be body positive about this body? When do I do that? Like, when? Because if where's the happy place? Where's the target? I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I've been wondering, and just for me, it changes so much that I don't know. Sometimes I still slip back into that place of, I'm not going to think about it now. I'm going to think about it later.
Okay, I have another question. How do you deal with nosy people who tend to ask too many questions about non-binary people, especially because if the non-binary person is very androgynous, people always are super interested in knowing about their genitals. I found that people just make assumptions. Well, I don't know. Because no one asks me about my genitals, but they ask other people about my genitals.
I have had people ask me, but it's mostly, again, been online, like on dating websites,
Right.
or things like that. I did have somebody, like, I guess saw that I had hairy armpits for my car and came up to my window when I was parked at a red light and started asking me in a very bad way about my genitals.
That's Texas, I guess.
Yeah, that is Texas.
I think nosy people, I just would kind of harass them back. Would be my first choice. It depends. It depends. I think whether or not you're annoyed by them and like you don't particularly care about them. Because if they're someone close to you, they're a family member or a good friend, you can explain to them that this is like not appropriate and it makes you uncomfortable.
Right.
But if it's some random asshole who's just come up to you in a car, maybe it's just best to be an asshole back. Speak their language. Do you ever feel like you enjoy your gender?
Sometimes I do, and sometimes, like you were talking about, I feel that freedom of not having to force myself into some gender role or whatever. But I don't know. I'm trying to get to a place where I have more of that gender euphoria people talk about, but it's been tricky for me.
I find that I can sort of express my gender in a particular way and feel really excited about it and feel really good and feel like sexy sometimes, but I don't feel like I have a lot of control over when those times are.
Yeah, it's the same for me. I just enjoy it when it comes. Because I know it's not always going to be like that, and I'm going to have days when I feel pretty sad.
Do you feel like you need to connect more with other people who are trans masculine? Or, I mean, I don't know how you feel about those words. I feel weird about the terms trans masculine and trans feminine because I don't want to have to, I'm not transitioning to feminine. I don't know, I'm transitioning to pretty with long hair. I guess that's feminine. That's what I want out of it. But yeah, it's just a bit like, this is the terminology we use, I guess. But like, and I feel weird about that actually, because it means you're trans masculine and I'm trans feminine, and I always had this idea that we were the same gender, but it's weird to be non-binary but still be put in this category that like really particularly genders you.
Yeah, I don't really use that word for myself. Like, it's not really upsetting if somebody uses it for me, but I would never, explain my gender to somebody as trans masculine. I guess like one thing that has been really positive about taking tea is that, as people start to perceive certain things about me as more masculine, it gives me a lot more freedom to do things I wanted to before but felt uncomfortable doing, like wearing lacy clothes or sparkly makeup or things like that I think, before would just reinforce to everybody that, I was really a woman, and, it would just, like, make people misgender me even more. And now I just feel, like, more free to do that, and that makes me very happy.
Yeah, it's interesting that we have this experience of gender where we don't want gender fuckery. And if we're not perceived to be fucking gender, then it's kind of, then that's what's stressful. Surely we should want to just conform to like manhood and womanhood. Surely that's the thing that would make it most easy. But so many of us are like, I want to look like a girl but dressed like a boy, or I want to look like a boy and dress like a girl.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like that is something that gives me some happiness, even when I'm feeling really stressed about my gender there.
Yeah, I just want to be a pretty girl in a suit. Honestly. I want to wear the boy clothes, but I want to look like a pretty girl at the same time. Honestly, this is like, that's my gender. That's all it comes down to. I want to be Jane dressed as Tarzan.
With like presentation, I just like to, I guess, like switch it up and mix and match a lot, which I've been feeling more comfortable doing lately.
Yeah, I feel a little bit like like in our kind of gendered situations where I think it's fair to say we both feel pretty middle ground when it comes to gender, but like we have these like opposite traumas where I've been like forced to be a boy, so like being seen as a boy and not having the choice of being like coming away from being a boy, I find that really stressful. Do you feel that way about being seen as a girl?
Yeah, I do feel that way. So that's why, like when I was saying, being gendered as a man is still misgendering, but it happens so much less often, and it wasn't this box that I was pushed into since I was a child, that it feels less painful to me.
Do you think we should erase gender from humanity?
I don't think so. I think gender can be really fun. I think it can be really good and important part of someone's identity. I just wish that we could get to a place where we were, as people, not enforcing things on other people and letting people, have their own gender explorations and being more supportive of each other. Do you think we should erase gender?
I like being in spaces where gender doesn't exist. I liked that when we lived together as two non-binary people that like we had. I like to call it like a gender deprivation chamber. like sometimes you get to be with people where it just feels like there is no gender between you and you can just forget about it. But also when you're alone, when you're alone, it's like gender is something that it takes two to tango. Like someone has to read your gender. Like it's not something that happens when you're alone in a room. It's like it's a relationship you have with the world around you in some ways. Maybe other people would disagree, but that's how it is for me. I feel like gender is the relationship I have with humanity. And I don't know what else it is, because it's not gender expression and it's not bodies, right? Like, so it's this intangible force that happens when people are communicating, even if that's just looking at each other.
Right. I feel like I do have an internal sense of gender, even when I'm on my own, but I do think a lot of that does come, from relationships with other people and, how other people have and will continue to perceive me. I think it's hard to untangle both of those things from each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel that I have an internal sense of a lack of gender, and it's hard for me to relate to the idea of having a tangible internal sense of gender, but it does seem like quite prominent, and I believe people, but I don't have it. And I think that's, I feel like that's something a lot of bisexuals do, especially when they're first coming out. They're like, well, surely everyone is bisexual, because if I feel this way, I don't understand how you could be like one. Like how is it possible to be monosexual? It's just like, and I feel that way about gender. I'm just like, how can you? I don't understand what that must feel like, but obviously that's because I have a single biased perspective, and the world is made up of a lot of different perspectives and different peoples and experiences. So, what advice would you give a young non-binary person, or an old non-binary person who's just coming out and needs to find themselves and find happiness?
I found, finding a supportive community to be the most helpful thing for me, because, I've talked a lot about having a lot of stress and anxiety about gender and having a hard time with it. I feel like since I have been more open with my friends and having people in my life that, even if they don't fully understand where I'm coming from, I know they still love me and care about me and support me. That's been the most helpful thing for me.
Yeah.
Just feeling all that, all that support from other people who have my back, even if I don't have my own sometimes. Yeah.
And I think if you can, it's important to find that IRL rather than online.
Sure. I know it can be hard in some places to find that, but if it's possible, I think even just to find one person that you trust and you can talk to and will be supportive, I think that's really the best thing you can do. Thank you so much, Tovah, for coming on Trans Uncensored. Thanks for having me. You've been listening to Trans Uncensored, produced by Društvo Kvartir. If you have any questions about being trans or trans issues, please check out our Tumblr, društvokvartir.tumblr.com, and you can send us an anonymous ask, or you can email us at info@kvartir.org. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.